Hey, coming at you live from beautiful BC and somewhere in the United States. This is Left by the Valley 2.0. My name is Kevin, and I'm going to work on being less condescending. Condescending means talking down to people. Corbin, man, how you doing?
Too bad I got a dog whining at the door right now. I might need to get my kid to let her out, but
good. And we don't have just any Kyle. We have Cosmic Kyle with us. Kyle, how you doing, brother?
Can't complain, Kevin.
Excellent. And coming back at us from the lost prodigal son, going back from Red Reed, my friend. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. Hanging in there, you know.
Excellent.
Surviving hurricanes and stuff. It's crazy. Just dodging them, you know. It's like, wow.
It's
like the
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show. We have a very interesting guest with us today. Coming back, our returning champion, Dr. Darrel Ray. Dr. Ray, welcome back. Oh, Dr. Ray, it's been a while, my friend. How have you been?
I've been great. I'm probably sleep deprived because I had a party at my house last night. We stayed up a little bit too late, and I got up a little bit too early.
Yeah, and if people don't know, the parties at Dr. Ray's ranch in Kansas are legendary.
We kept our clothes on last night. I'll just tell you that it wasn't the best.
Well, we're still technically in a pandemic, so you got to keep the clothes here to be safe.
There you go.
Yeah, but really fancy masks to wear too. No?
I have had parties where we went full nude. I didn't necessarily, but other people did.
I can see myself being asked to go home immediately, showing up to one of those parties. But
I mean, people would look at me and be like, "Who let in the orangutan?"
It's one of the jokes I use on a regular basis when people say, "Hey, how have you been?" I say, "Well, I was invited to a naked wedding where I was voted the best man." Dr. Ray, maybe you'd be so kind to give our audience a quick bio of who Dr. Darrel Ray is.
Well, I got to quit laughing before I can do that. That was a good one, Kevin. Most of your damn dad jokes are horrible, but that was worth something.
High praise.
Yeah. So where do I begin? I'm a psychologist. I'm a retired psychologist. I still do a lot of things around the secular community. The main thing I do is help run Recovery from Religion, the organization I founded back in 2009, and the Secular Therapy Project that I founded in 2012. Both organizations are thriving, doing great. We're and Recovery from Religion now has got probably in the neighborhood of 300 volunteers, spread over about 18 time zones, literally from Moscow to Perth, Australia, which is pretty broad. And we have 657 registered secular therapists now with over 30,000 registered clients, all in 9 different countries. Actually, it's probably more than that for the clients, but 9 countries for the therapists. And anyway, that's what I do with most of my time when I'm not giving parties for friends who are getting married. That was the purpose of the party last night.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say this, we have a kick-ass secular community in Kansas City where I live. It's a very large community, very active community, and very supportive of community. It's and very sex positive community. So we have an oasis here. We actually have the second oasis here in Kansas City that was ever formed. And it continues thriving after almost, I think about 8 years now we've been going.
Mm-hmm.
With Oasis. But anyway, I don't know. That's kind of who I am or where. And I've written these 2 books, Sex and God and The God Virus. And I have my
prove it.
This is a miniature of my own. I'll just tell you.
Sure, man. Sure. Yeah.
I thought you were just trying to raise breast cancer awareness with the pink and everything.
Well, today we'll be talking about sexual norms throughout history and all around the world. But before all that, since we talked already about recovering from religion, let's make the announcement, Darrel. I'll give you the honor if you want.
Oh, I'd rather you do it. It's
Okay.
much more fun to hear somebody else talk about it than me. I drone on and on and on about it.
Well, since we love recovering from religion so much, here at Left of the Valley, we decided to do a fundraiser for recovering from religion. What we're going to do, we're going to do a virtual bingo game, and this is going to happen Saturday, November 12th. So mark your calendars, Saturday, November 12th. So what we will do in the next couple of days, we'll set out a link, and you can go to Recovering from Religion, and you can buy a virtual bingo card. Will be sent to you. We'll be playing a game in the background of the show as we go live for about 3-4 hours on the Saturday the 12th, like I said. And we'll have amazing guests. We'll have guests like Dr. Darrel Ray. We'll have Seth Andrews, Matt Dillahunty, David Fitzgerald, and a plethora of other guests and prizes. So as we play the game in the background, you will be winning books and T-shirts and even tickets to conferences. So you don't want to miss this. So you go online right now and, well, anyway, when the link is up, because I'm not sure the link is up yet, it's very soon, go out there and buy your virtual bingo game and help Recovering from Religion and all the great work they do. Is that good enough of a spin?
And I want to add that the big focus of this particular fundraiser is our international expansion. We're focusing mainly on Australia, New Zealand, that area right now. But we're developing funding so we can really expand into that into the Asian area, especially Australia.
Fantastic. So, like I said, mark your calendars, November 12th. November 12th. All of us will be here, and we'll have a great time doing all this. Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about sex.
Baby.
So this is a very interesting topic that everybody loves to talk about sex, and there's something very interesting, especially here in North America. We live in a couple of countries that have been highly influenced by Christianity, and this influence has, maybe for lack of a better word, perverted our notion of sexual relationships. Dr. Ray, what are your thoughts on how people perceive sex today? And maybe, if you'd be so kind, maybe with your extreme experience, you can take us into how people did that in the past as compared to now.
Well, I think it's important to frame sexuality historically by eliminating, if we could, mentally erasing the patriarchal religions that have sprung up over the last 2,500 years. That would be beginning with Zoroastrianism, and then next would be Buddhism, and then Judaism, and then Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam. I should have started with Hinduism, actually. But those 6 religions are all patriarchal and extremely sex negative, and always have been from very early on, although they have different mixtures of it. What if we took all those religions and just erased them from history? What would we have left? How would cultures have developed? How would sexuality be viewed? And we can do that by just looking at what we know about many cultures that are even alive and existed today that have not been totally overwhelmed by patriot. For example, Amazonian hunter-gatherer cultures, or Muoso cultures in China, or the Hadza culture, hunter-gatherer culture in Africa. If we use those, as we look at those and say, this was probably what sexuality looked like 10,000 years ago, before all these patriarchal religions came along, then we can start talking about what human sexuality really is. Whereas right now, if we have a conversation today, I'm guaranteeing every one of us on this call will have some tainted ideas about sexuality that probably aren't really related to who we are as a human being. It's more who we are as a Christian, or who you are as a Muslim. Even as a former Christian or former Muslim or former Jew, it doesn't matter. You still got ideas about sexuality that's probably not accurate in terms of if you had erased those. And does that make sense, Kevin?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, for the longest time, even myself, to my great shame, although I was not against the LGBTQ community, I was not necessarily an ally either. I did not understand the LGBTQ community, and that was probably influenced directly a lot by my Catholic upbringing.
Yeah, it sure was. And if you look at, let's just take trans people right now. There are many cultures that weren't just binary, sexually, that have a gender binary. They had multiple genders, and people oftentimes could move from one gender to the other, or from another, through the different genders in a more fluid way. There's a very interesting story that is relayed by a historian I listened to recently. Daniele Benelli. He did a story on the Little Bighorn, the Custer and all that. And in that was just one of 3 battles that actually happened. It's the most famous, of course, but there were other battles. And in one of these battles, there was what we would call a trans woman who had lived her whole life, as female. But at one point in time during the battles, her own sister or her own brother got wounded, and she decided to change into a warrior. She went back, got her warrior stuff, changed it to a warrior, and then went out and promptly massacred a whole bunch of U.S. soldiers and rescued her brother. That is a fluid sexuality, if I ever heard of one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a fascinating story because she was born, quote unquote, male, but became female and lived that way for her up through her adult life until this battle, at which time she decided, well, I'm going to go back and be a warrior and kill some soldiers, rescue my brother, and come back. And nobody took notice of it. It was like, well, that's pretty normal. But it's ludicrous in the way our culture looks at it. Now, the interesting thing was when she got back, into safely back, she transformed back into a woman. The U.S. Army was they actually ended up capturing her and her sub-tribe or clan, and they treated her horribly, really persecuted her, because they said the minister, when the Protestant minister got a hold of her, they basically said, you have to be a man because that was it, you're born, with that old fight that we see all the time.
Wait a minute. You are telling me right here that U.S. soldiers treated someone who was First Nations in a horrible way? I'm shocked. What I tell you?
It happened. I'm sure very rarely. But anyway, it is an illustration of how our culture coming up against another culture that had a very different view of sexuality. And this, of course, happened in the 1870s, around that time. So it was historically not a part of Western culture. It was historically a part of North American Native culture. And there was a lot of North American tribes that had this kind of understanding of gender. And there were, especially shaman, medicine people, oftentimes were, ambiguous about their gender, at least within the context of their own culture. So anyway, yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting that it's an unknown story, but at the same time, we'll never know exactly what went through the head of this woman that made her fluid in her identity, sexual identity. But at the same time, wouldn't that be giving ammo to the Christians that are basically saying, yeah, you can choose your sexuality, your orientation,
Well, there's because the subject today is sexual norms through history. That's just one example. There's so many examples moving into actual sex. Imagine if you're an Iroquois, Native American Iroquois in let's say 1100, 1200, 1300, long before Columbus comes and spreads his diseases. They lived in longhouses. There might be 80, 100 people living in a longhouse. Mm-hmm. How the hell do you have sex in a longhouse without everybody noticing? Well, there's actually documentation of an early French fur trader who I don't remember the details, but I think he married one of the tribe members, and so he has access to see what's going on inside the longhouse. And he wrote of the fact that people would just have sex right there in the longhouse, and they'd be loud about it. They'd be, I mean, just unashamed about it.
Mhm.
And 80 other people would be coming and going while people are fucking in one, in their own little part of the longhouse with no walls, no privacy. But nobody seemed to notice. They actively avoided looking in that direction. They gave people psychological privacy, I guess you could say, if not physical privacy. Well, can you imagine? Can you imagine that in Western culture anywhere?
Yeah. I just have this imagination of someone walking in or whatever, and it's like, it's like, if you change the angle a little bit, it's going to be like way better. Or have you tried that inverted? Like, no Maverick style.
Here, and then you get the other leg.
I mean, I'm just imagining them being so casual about it. Like they walk up, "Hey, Steve, I see you're busy, but have you seen the football game recently? Did you see that?" Like that comfortable.
Or in the middle, doing someone comes along, gives you a high five.
I don't think I'd be doing that to an Iroquois. They were known to be a pretty aggressive warrior.
Oh, yeah,
and,
absolutely. And fun fact too, the longhouse is actually the beginning of the word. Was actually, they were named Kanatas, and that is the origin of the word Canada. Because when they were talking about the longhouses, they didn't quite understand what it meant. And it actually meant the longhouse. It meant the village, and this is how Canada got the word for the country began. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, it is very.
I will like to add those like two-spirited people, like in native cultures, whatever, they were usually revered higher than. Or at least what I've read, they were revered as higher importance than of hetero people because of the fact that they were two-spirited and could see things from a male and female perspective. They could offer better insight into certain situations and problems. So,
yeah. The whole concept of two spirits, I think, is fascinating, and actually, you think about it, it's pretty damn accurate. It at least has elements that are pretty damn accurate.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good allegory.
I do too. And that was the North American term for it. But there are other cultures that have similar, had terms for the same thing. I don't know what they are right offhand, but it's not unique just to North American cultures. In fact, there's still cultures in South America that have a two-spirit kind of approach to life around gender and sexuality.
I think it's very fascinating the way that we have the tendency to hide. I think I like to quote the late great John Lennon, who used to say, it's amazing that we display violence on TV, but yet we hide to make love. You know, and it really kind of speaks a lot about our entire culture as it is.
Well, we're also coming out of the Victorian culture too, and like back then, like relationships, it's they were more of a facade than they were like, and because of the fact that like in public you had all this etiquette, all these rules, how you spoke, how you talked. Behind closed doors, it could be different, or whatever. But it also set this precedence of a lot of prudish behavior that I think we still see in our culture today. But I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can expand on that, Darrell. But
about on prudish culture.
Well, just Victorian influences on.
Right.
On like today's culture, there's a lot of stuff that still exists.
Well, we call it Victorian, but I think you got to go back another 200 years, because Victorianism came from somewhere, or that prudishness came from somewhere. And my observation, and I could be wrong. I'm not a professional historian, although I am pretty good at the history. Is it came out of the Puritan movement, and from which we get the whole notion of purity culture today. You can draw a direct line clear back to, the Puritans of the early 1600s in England. And of course, the Puritans came to the United States, And I've got Australian friends that says England gave all you guys the religious sexual perverts, and we got the criminals. And there's a lot more to that. There's quite a bit to that, I think. But purity culture can be traced clear back or to the not to the Queen Victoria, although right about the time she took over, there was an increase in purity. It started way back in the early 1600s when the Puritans started their drive to take over England, ultimately culminating in the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell. And then it was a very sexually repressive regime in many ways, or ideology, not regime, ideology. And they tried to impose a lot of things on England that hadn't been there before. England was, much more sexually free. English culture, not that it was, it was still Western, still had patriarchal notions. I'm not saying that, but for example, marriage. I can't remember her name, wrote a great book called The History of Marriage. Well, if you look at the history of marriage wasn't that common among the common people in, say, a thousand years ago, almost exactly 1,000 years ago. If you look at who was getting married then, it wasn't the common people. If you wanted to, you shack up with somebody, you did. You had kids and you were, quote, partners for life. But the people that had to get married were those who had property. If you didn't own property, why do you need to get married? The nobility and the church were not concerned with the peasants. They're only concerned with the people who could give them money and land and give them control. So the marriage records are very sparse with people 1,000, 1,200 years ago. We know exactly which noble married which nobles. We do not know which peasant married which peasant. Those records don't exist because marriage wasn't a thing. When you wanted to get married, you just, ask, hey, you want to shack up together and have some kids? So, or, oh, I hear you're pregnant. Well, I'll move in with you and we'll raise the kid. It really was that loose. We have this notion of marriage in our culture right now, but that notion did not exist 1,200 years ago in Europe, especially not in England. I'm more knowledgeable about England, but do read the book. It's called A History of Marriage, I believe. Anne Fish, I can't remember her last name right now.
Yeah. If I read it properly, like if you go back far enough, like 1,200 years ago, it's at that point, even when you had marriage, sex wasn't permitted in marriage unless there was an intention to have a child. And the church had so many rules of when you could have sex. Like you couldn't have sex on Sundays because of church. You can't have church on Thursdays and Fridays because you're supposed to be preparing for communion. Lent, 40, 65 days for Lent, that's out. A month moving up to Christmas, that's out. Pentecost, that's out. Like 70% of your time in marriage, you weren't allowed to do anything. And that's what the church demanded of people. And they had authority of the what do you call the ecclesiastical churches or courts? They had like their own court systems separate from the segregate, separate from like the actual monarch's court system or whatever. And and they were constantly judging on what was right, what was wrong, what was moral, and what wasn't. And it's been like that like for quite some time.
It has probably it's increased in that and has increased over the last 1,200 years. But if you go back more than 1,200 years, you'll see a lot of pagan influence in sexuality. And the church doesn't even try to control certain kinds of behavior and activities. For example, marriage, In 800 AD, nobody was too concerned if a peasant woman, man and woman were married or not.
Was there like less murder and killing of everybody like else in the pagan cultures rather than the religious ones where they're all pent up like that? It's
a good question.
Murder.
That's a good question. It's actually a good question. What do you go, bud?
Well, go read Steven Pinker's book. He's got an answer to some of that. I'm not sure. I'm not totally convinced of Pinker's thesis that there's less violence than there used to be, but I don't know.
I've got a good question for you. So we know that the Abrahamic religions are very concerned with sex. What other cultures connect sex with God or gods or spirituality?
Well, the patriarchal ones seem to almost have a corner on that market. However, if you go back about 1,000 years in India, you've seen the pictures of the temples that have explicit sexual scenes on them. I mean, orgy scenes even, and those are everywhere in India. The temples are filled with sexual stuff. And yet, India is one of the most sexually repressive. It's the 145th worst country on the planet for women. It's a dangerous place for women. Maybe not quite as dangerous as Saudi Arabia, but it's pretty high. It's pretty low on the totem pole for that. But why did India become? Why are these frescoes or friezes, I guess they call them, on the temples with all this sex, orgy sex and phalluses? All that stuff, why is it there? And it's because that culture was not sex negative nearly to the degree. And it did tie sex to certain gods and goddesses, but they had multiple gods and goddesses. And if you move clear, a quarter of the way around to the world to Rome, and if you ever visited Pompeii or the reproductions of Pompeii, you know that there was pornography everywhere in Pompeii. I mean, they had penises, phalluses coming out of the stores to advertise what they were doing. It was all over the place in Pompeii and in Herculaneum as well. Probably this was just one. I mean, we know this because it got frozen in time with the explosion of Vesuvius covering and killing the people. There was no time to take down the penises before you got out of there.
I used to think that was Sodom and Gomorrah.
And Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah, that's another one. Yeah,
I thought, but I was like, oh, that's got to be Pompeii. They just changed the name.
Yeah,
ancient people be kinky like me.
Well, I think
you go Dr. Darrel Ray's ranch, he also has those frescoes on his walls all over the place.
So, like back in ancient Rome or whatever, they had dualism taught by Plato and stuff. And of course, when the Christians kind of started mixing religions with their pagan roots, whatever, you had Gnostic Christians who, first with dualism, if I explain this wrong, correct me. But it's the idea that you have our physical reality, and then you have our spiritual reality. And so the Gnostics, the way they incorporated Christianity was, we're spiritually safe. So when it comes to physical stuff, anything goes. And it was kind of like the same thing in Roman culture, where it's like sex and physical stuff that was separate from your spiritual side. But then when Pauline Christianity came along, our bodies were a temple of God. So doing anything sinful or defiling like sex or whatever, it's you're destroying that temple, thus removing yourself from God, and then that just kind of snowballs into further and further doctrines throughout history. Or am I off on that? Or
no, you're actually perfectly. I would totally agree with what you're saying. I would back up. You're talking with where the Christianity and Greek philosophy came in, but if you back up just a little bit before Christianity comes along, Greek sexuality was still tied to gods and goddesses. And of course, it was patriarchal. Women were treated rather badly. There was sexual slavery and all that sort of stuff in Greece. I'm not defending that at all. I'm just saying it was a different approach. But Christianity came along and seemed to grab some of the components of Platonism and other Greek philosophy and incorporate it in such a way that made Christianity more effective in infecting people and making them ashamed of their bodies. The key to all these patriarchal religions is if you make people ashamed of their bodies, they'll be trapped by their religion. Religion gives you the disease of shame, and then it offers you the cure. Come here and we'll forgive you, and you got to stay pure. You can't masturbate, you can't have sex. Women have to be second-class citizens, all that sort of stuff. The same thing was true of India. I mean, that's why I mentioned India first earlier. All these were tied to different gods until Islam came along. Islam really screwed over India, even though India is predominantly, or at least the India we know today is predominantly Hindu. Hinduism was incredibly influenced by Islam. And it's most obvious in the fact that until Islam came, most women in South India were topless. They didn't wear anything on their top. It's hot down there. It's almost equatorial. But the Muslims come along and they culturally conquer. They didn't physically conquer India, all of India, but they did culturally conquer it, and that led to women have to cover up, and that's why you see so much. You don't see nudity as you see on the friezes of those temples anymore.
Yeah.
Was
that before Islam's Reformation movement with the oh crap, I forget his name right now, but because like Islam around 1200 AD-ish went through a Reformation where they kind of went from knowledge based and loved and learning about different cultures to being very prudish. You gotta the body's the temple, and then like that's when the burqa got introduced. And that's when and that's also when like women got really pushed down on the social ladder as well.
Yep, right. And the Kama Sutra was well known in India, and then it got suppressed by Islam. And then it's not just Islam suppressed. If you look at Pakistan and Bangladesh right now, they are gigantically Muslim majority, right? They weren't 1,000 years ago. That whole area was Hindu, but that was the conquest of Islam. And while they succeeded in kind of on the east and the west side of India, conquering Pakistan and Bangladesh, they didn't conquer India, but they did impose that prudish sexuality. And that's when the Kama Sutra went out of fashion. Well, if you look at the friezes on the temples, those are just illustrating the Kama Sutra's principles and ideals. If you go back even farther in China, there's a similar thing that happens in China with sexuality. Chinese sexuality was much freer than it has been for the last 1,000 years. And that can be looked at directly probably as the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism, which became very male dominant, but they weren't to begin with. They started out a little bit more free. I could go on and on about that, but you wanted to know about the history. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I've got an interesting question on that, because so far we've established that there's obviously a lot of influence from different cultures on what becomes the sexual norm of the time. But if we were to erase all these cultural influences from a biological point of view, is there a biological, for lack of a better term, a biological norm to human species of how we usually interact with sexuality?
Yes and no. I think there is a biological bottom line, but it's so tainted by culture. We are the only species that culture really dominates us in so many ways that we are actually breeding ourselves. Chimpanzees have a different sexuality than bonobo chimps have. And they have very different sexuality, but if you combine the free-flowing sexuality of the bonobo apes with the more male-dominated chimpanzees, you really kind of get humans. That we have both tendencies. Some cultures are very bonobo-like with much more. For example, the Hawaiian culture before Western contact, you could fuck anybody you want. There was not a lot of rules about who you had sex with.
You mean getting laid in Hawaii was more than just getting flowers? Or
yeah, getting laid, right? Exactly. But the king and queen, the monarchy, the nobility, they were regulated. It was important who they married and that they were married. You in Hawaiian culture, again, before Western contact, you could get your head chopped off for eating the wrong food, but nobody cared who you had sex with. It was a very different. I mean, you think about it, there's a lot of cultures that have food taboos. I mean, pork among Jews and Muslims, for example, and meat among many sects of Hinduism. There's very strong food taboos, and there were very strong food taboos in Hawaii, but there were not sexual taboos like we think of today. So historically, Hawaii was a pretty free-flowing sexual environment. I mean, they had their rules. I mean, rape was still illegal and stuff like that, but women had far more to say about the sexual relationships than a Western culture would admit to. And there's other cultures, for example, the Mo'oso culture in China, I think one of the most fascinating cultures on the planet, where they have no word for husband, they have no word for wife, they have no word for marriage, because there is no marriage in that culture. And when a girl becomes, in that culture, a girl starts as a child, and then when she has her first period, she becomes an adult. There is no adolescence in this culture. You go straight from being a child to being a woman. You have your first period, then you are given an outdoor exit to your compound, and the woman can invite any man in she wants. There's one rule, though, and it's a very hard and fast rule there. You have to be out before breakfast. Men cannot stay. You don't shack up together. You don't live together. And the uncles are the male figures for all the children. The father, if you ask a Mo'oso woman who's the father of this child, she doesn't know and she doesn't care. It's irrelevant. He's off in some village 10 miles away. He comes in twice a week and spends the night with me. That's the way it works in the Mo'oso culture. Now that's pretty different. And we know historically, this culture has been like this for at least 1,000 years because Marco Polo wrote about it. Marco Polo literally visited this culture and wrote about it. The interesting thing, he wrote it from an Italian male macho perspective. Basically, he says the Mo'oso men don't control their women. He had no idea that women could actually control themselves, and the men had nothing to say about it.
I think Marco Polo didn't go to Hawaii. It was actually safer to eat a woman than eat a pineapple.
Yeah, I feel like I remember I was just listening to a show, like a sort of a historical show about Christopher Columbus, and he was saying that like one of the things that Christopher Columbus wrote down was that the culture of where they were, it was like great, he's like, because they believe that sex is like getting power from like other culture, they're from them, and like so guys would just like come up and be like, can you please fuck my wife for me, really need the power from that. So
yeah,
so weird.
Hold on for a sec. Really?
That's what he said.
I don't know.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of information. That was the Taino, Taino tribe, I believe, or peoples. There were quite a few different cultures that he and his group contacted. We don't have a lot of information about that, but that was a common belief structure in the Caribbean. There's also some other areas where it's a belief structure as well.
Wow.
There's another. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead, doctor.
Well, there's another. Again, if we erase, you asked the question: is there a kind of like a biological bottom line?
Yeah.
If we erase these cultures, if we look at all these cultures that have not been tainted by Western patriarchal religions, one of the groups that stands out in my mind are 26 or so cultures of the Amazon. Out of 48, I believe it's 48 cultures that have been studied in the Amazon, 26 of them have a primitive scientific belief in something called partible paternity. I don't know if you ever heard of that concept. Partible paternity is the belief. If you were just observing dogs or observing pigs, or not pigs, the animal that looks like a pig, tapirs or something like that in South America, you would notice that the female often mates with multiple males. And as a primitive observation, scientific observation, if you will, you might come to the conclusion that it takes many males to create a healthy baby. So in these cultures, they believe that a woman needs to be sure and have sex with 2-3 men, or her babies are not going to be healthy.
Huh.
It's an energy concept, not unlike or similar to what we just talked about with the Taino. Is if you have 2 or 3 men putting their energy into the development of the baby, then you're going to have a healthier baby. This is a strong belief within these 26 cultures.
Interesting.
So, so again, you can see here the female has got strong control over her own body, her own sexuality. She will probably actively seek the most virile men, or the men she perceives as being the strongest and healthiest to have sex with. I mean, it's an interesting thing if you erase that cultural component and say, what if we believe it takes many different sperm from different men? Then it changes the behavior radically.
There's also, it's interesting because there's been a lot of discussion fairly recently about how apparently science, I don't know if you heard about this, Darrell, they talk about apparently women could somehow manage to capture some DNA from former lovers. Is there anything to this? Is there just complete quackery? Or
I haven't heard anything like that.
yeah, apparently, I guess it probably it falls directly exactly what you were saying there. You know, apparently women would have this innate ability to be capable of incorporating DNA from former lovers into their offspring somehow. And I have no idea how that would work, but you know, I heard there's been some talk about this.
I'd have to see the scientific evidence for that.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
not really sure about
That
that.
might just come down to a nature and nurture argument too. Like,
It could be. Well, you know, it sounds exactly like what we were just discussing with the Amazon tribe. So, if we were to do an experiment, let's say we had like we create this tribe of people, and we basically remove the influence from our normal culture, kind of give them still the tools to be able to survive. Is there a specific sexual behavior we would expect to emerge naturally out of Homo sapiens?
I do not think so. I think our brains are so dominated and focused and developed by culture itself. I don't see how. I mean, I'm kind of contradicting myself here. I know. I don't know how you would ever erase culture. It is such an important component to the way we live. Maybe it wasn't 300,000 years ago. I don't know. Then you'd have to go back that far to find any kind of, quote, natural norm for humans. You might even have to go farther back to our common ancestor with the great apes or whatever. I just don't know. But what I will say is if you start studying enough different cultures, if you study the Hadza culture in Africa, you study the Momoso culture in China, you study the Mangaian culture and South Pacific and the Hawaiian culture, you start putting all these cultures that existed all over the planet, including the Amazonian ones, and you start looking at what's some common denominators in that. You might be able to. I'm not saying I know. I don't think I know anyway. I think you might see some patterns there that we could say are probably specific to humans. But what I do know is if you take chimpanzees, you take bonobos, and you combine the sexuality of those two, or the sexual expressions that they have, we look a lot like them. We can look like asshole chimpanzees, or we can look like, wonderful, loving bonobos. We can do it all. A bonobo cannot act like an asshole chimpanzee, and a chimp certainly can't act like a loving bonobo. So we're much more flexible in our sexual expression than either one of those. And that's, I'd rather have the bonobo expression than the chimpanzee, because that does lead to murder sometimes.
I think nobody likes thinking of human beings as chimps, but you're telling me about that, and I'm remembering a story here in BC a couple years back where a woman wanted to use a bathroom at a fast food restaurant. They wouldn't let her without ordering. So she proceeded to take a crap on the floor, pick up the crap, and throw it at the person behind the counter. And I'm like, yeah, we have devolved into a society of apes.
Wow.
Where's Charles Heston when you need him?
Dang. Okay.
Unless you're going to get a shitty review, I bet.
Well, I remember seeing a meme with a chimp grinning, saying, "Excuse me, I'm going to need those bathroom keys." But something that I kind of noticed with when I was looking at sexuality in medieval Europe or whatever was abstinence was a really big thing. But they also noticed abstinence had a lot of physical health problems that went along with it. So they had tried to cure the abstinence different ways, like either through special diets. Some people thought if you cried enough, it'd be the same as sex. And then one of the things that I found really shocking was like bleeding, since semen is a fluid that comes out of the body, and blood's a fluid that comes out of the body. Then we'll just balance the body off by just taking out more blood, which I guess would work if they're wheeling you out of the church in a wheelbarrow, pale white, and it's like, do you feel like having sex anymore? I just want to sleep. But it's like, what kind of, like, are you aware of like any other like really bizarre ways that people coped with sexual norms? Which
there are some. Yeah, what you just said is it reminded me of some. It's not just that; it's other kind of sexual norms around, say, circumcision. The Dr. Kellogg of Kellogg cereal fame, for example, he thought, if you circumcise baby boys, they won't masturbate as much when they get older. They won't have a big sex drive when they get older.
Yeah. Well, didn't he also want to put like acid on women's vaginas to make them less sensitive too?
Actually did that. And it's not unlike clitoridectomies that some Muslim cults have practiced in the past. I mean, Dr. Kellogg was a jerk. He was a horrible person. Jeez. But we're suffering today. I mean, some of us guys, I'm circumcised, and I really wish I hadn't been. But my parents were doing, what everybody said you should do. But there's those kinds of norms. Whether you want to bleed somebody or cut the tip off their penis, they're all coming from a religious mindset that falls right out of patriarchal religions to control sexuality of men and women. That's the bottom line of religion. That's its whole purpose. And that's why religions love to use your sex, because it's the one thing you can't control. And so if you can't control it, or you can't control it perfectly, what I mean, then it gives you a great place to sin and then be forced to come back to Jesus, or confess your sins to the priest who jacked off himself that morning, or whatever. That's what's going on there.
I was reading one story. Sorry, go ahead.
The Catholic Church in medieval Europe was full of all sorts of crazy ideas, and you can find any number of them, not just in England, but in Germany and in France. Crazy ideas about what sex was and wasn't. And it's all based on this notion that sex is godly. Sex is something that is sacred. And if you don't do exactly the way we say it, then you're going to hell. That was a strong message starting about the 900s or maybe 1000. Before that, it was the monastic order, starting with St. Augustine and like others like him, that pushed this notion. I don't know if you've ever read any of the Ante-Nicene fathers, especially Tertullian. I always pronounce his reign wrong. Tertullian, I believe it is. Have you ever read any of his stuff? He is today revered as almost one of the key fathers of Christianity, fathers of Catholicism. Now, Protestants, if you're born and raised Protestant, you probably won't even know about him. If you're born and raised Catholic, you might. Priests definitely know about him. This guy was the most misogynistic jerk on the planet. And he was married. He wasn't even a priest. He was a theologian. There's a difference between a priest and a theologian. He was a theologian, but he was married, and he had these horrible ideas about sexuality and about women, and he wrote about them and about how horrible women were and how tempting they were and what we should do to them and with them. It was a bad treatise. He wrote thousands, I don't know, maybe 1,000 pages that we still have today. You can go to the library and check out Tertullian's treatises. Well, that has influenced Catholicism, and then, of course, by association, our Puritanism, even down to today. It was go read Tertullian. Go just get a few quotes from the guy. He's horrible, but that's a founder of the fucking Catholic Church right there.
Yeah,
and they have it just about him.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, like Augustine and a few other church fathers like them, they wrote like penitential manuals, I think they were called, and that set the pace for sexuality in the church for a really long time. And
right,
and at that time it was like Augustine. What did Augustine say about women? Something about loving or having sex with your wife too much is the same as adultery.
Yeah,
because like women were taught to be deceivers, and they were always corrupting the pure man or soul or whatever, and it was a really messed up culture, but to them it was normal.
Yeah, right. Well, and it reminds me of Pompey the Great. He married Julia, I believe, was the sister of Caesar, who we know says I could have my relationships wrong here. But one of the criticisms of Pompey was he loved his wife too much.
Wow.
Here's one of the greatest generals in all of Roman history, and his biggest criticism was he loved, because back then in Roman history, you could have concubines or you could have mistresses, but you had your wife had a different purpose. Hers was to have your babies and
Rome would have all these brothels and stuff like you were talking about, and they were all visited by the men, but the wives were expected to stay home, stay pure, while the guys went out and did everything, even like the neighbor's shoe or whatever. It's like anything went, because it's as long as you're spiritually saved, it's the physical doesn't matter. But like the Bible, Paul in the Bible even like talks to this effect or this mindset of people thinking that just because they're saved doesn't mean that they can physically do whatever they want. But and then that kind of just snowballed to become like extremely prudish and dangerous.
Another one who was prudish and misogynistic for sure.
Paul was bad, and Tertullian took his cue from Paul. He was just taking what Paul had and expanding it. There's a whole nother angle that we haven't even talked about really, and that is pre-agricultural societies, and it kind of goes back. It kind of goes back to what you asked, Kevin. And if we erased all these cultural things, well, if you go clear back to pre-agriculture, which means we erase the agricultural part and we ask the question, what is sexuality like in cultures that don't practice agriculture? Hunter-gatherers, of course, and herders would be two of the main things. Then we can start looking at what was the sexuality like of the Sarmatians of 300 BC in the steppes of Central Asia. And Herodotus writes about them. We're not sure he got his information firsthand, but he does say that women in the Sarmatian culture were, if not the warriors, they were warriors. And a woman could not get married. And I'm just quoting Herodotus here. I'm not saying this is fact, but a woman could not get married until she had killed a man in battle.
That's awesome.
And the women could ride horses as well as any man. And you got to remember something. And this is what makes it possibly true, what Herodotus says. Have you ever ridden a horse without a saddle?
It's not easy.
Fell off a horse without a saddle.
I have ridden bareback on a horse. In fact, I've probably ridden bareback on a horse more than I have with a saddle, and you got to be real careful. Just saying, women don't have to worry about that as much, okay? And the Sarmatian women evidently were incredibly good archers, and they could kill a man riding on a horse bareback with a very lethal weapon, bow and arrow weapon. So we're looking at a step kind of hunter-gatherer / herders, and how did their sexuality get expressed? And only recently, it's only been like the last 10 or 11 years, there's these kurgans. They're mounds. They're mounds in the steppes of Central Asia. They're big mounds that were built up. And until during the whole Soviet time and Russian archaeology time, there wasn't as good archaeology going on as there is now. But with recent archaeology, they're finding out what Herodotus said may have been true, or at least had some element of truth to it. These kurgans that are big mounds built by obviously wealthy and powerful, somebody wealthy and powerful, and buried inside, turn out that there's a remarkable number of women in there. And it's only a woman. There's not a man in there sometimes. There's maybe multiple horses buried with the woman. And there's armor and there's weapons buried with the woman in this kurgan. So Herodotus said the women were pretty strong. I would say if you're strong enough to get a mound built for you and get several horses buried and get your weapons, you're the only one in there. It's not like your husband's buried with you. You're the only one in that kurgan. And this is not, they found several kurgans like this. There's not just one or a few. There's several of them. Anyway, so that's one aspect. If we move to pre-agricultural societies and other places, we'll see that the culture, whether there's agriculture or not agriculture, whether there's hunter-gatherer, or herders, can have a real effect on us humans sexually. So the environment, it kind of answers your question a little bit, Kevin. The environment does have an impact on sexuality, but culture can have an enormous impact on sexuality. And here's a great example of what's going on. I'll give you two examples. One is breast size. Have you noticed that Western women, generally speaking, have larger breasts than Asian women?
And
I thought it was the hormones they put in the food.
We as humans are breeding ourselves. Sexual preferences around body type get pushed one way or the other. I mean, we've got other examples like lactose intolerance. Hunter-gatherers can't tolerate milk, but herders can. Well, how'd that come about? It probably came about in less than 9,000 years. Less than 9,000 years ago, nobody could drink milk. And now a large number of people can drink milk because we have bred ourselves. And I think that speaks a little bit to sexuality because we're breeding ourselves in various ways. And it's actually molding our bodies. I mean, breast size is the most obvious, but what other ways could we be breeding ourselves? And that's culture. That's not biology. And yet culture is influencing biology.
And culture can change so fast too, though. Like I remember when I was younger, we go to family campgrounds and it was only like 2 times this happened, but they actually had like drag shows for a variety night at the campground, and like everybody watched, they laughed, they hooted, they had a good time. But you do something like that nowadays, and it's people just lose their crap. So it's like so like culture, I think in some ways or some circles we're becoming more open, but in other circles we're becoming a lot more like even more repressed than what we were before.
I kind of remember some of that. I'll tell you, when I was a young teenager, even late childhood, I experienced a little bit of that as well. I think if I had looked through it with today's eyes, I would see incredible misogyny. I would see making fun of people, in derogatory ways. I didn't feel that at the time, but I look back on it and say, if I was the victim of that, I'd feel bad about it. So I don't know. Culture does change.
I didn't even think about it that way, but that's definitely something to reflect on.
Yeah.
Dr. Ray, one last question because we're running against the clock there.
Okay.
In the future and what's happening right now, because right now we've talked a lot about culture and we talked also about, for lack of a better term, nature. It seems to me that right now we're experiencing a bit of an expression of natural human sexuality in our culture, but there's also right now, especially like you look at what happens in the U.S., a cultural backlash. You talk about Roe versus Wade, for example, or stuff like that, attempting to control female sexuality. As a psychologist, how positive are you about human sexual contact in the U.S. in the near future, or are we going down a darker path?
Well, I think religion, as I say in my book, The God Virus, religion is always looking for new angles. It has to in order to survive. The religion that has no new angles is going to die. That's why most religions are dead today. The most successful ones live. And since sexualities are important, religions latched onto that. The whole purity culture thing, for example. However, I think it's a dark side in some slivers. But how the hell are you going to stop this? I live in Kansas, and we had an amendment to our Constitution that was voted on in early August, and we defeated that amendment by 17 points. We crushed the opposition. There were strongly Republican counties in western Kansas that voted 40% against that amendment. They voted 80% for Trump. So that tells you even Republicans don't like the direction we're going with abortion. So I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic, Kevin, that the Supreme Court has screwed us over bad enough that I think it's starting to wake some people up, and they're starting to vote. We had people voting that clearly had not voted before. We had Republicans voting for this, quote, democratic idea of women's rights. So I don't know where it's going to go. It'll be an interesting 2 or 3 years from now, I think.
Yeah. Excellent. Joy, one last word you want to say?
I was just going to say something that I noticed was as soon as the Christian lobbyists were able to get Roe versus Wade lifted or whatever, it's like all of a sudden it just seems like there's been this sudden massive push attacking the LGBTQTS. That's a tongueful. But also you start to see all these attacks online for the gender for people on the gender spectrum, almost like that's their next battle against sex that they're going against. And and if I was going to say with anything else or whatever, it was one quote that I heard that nothing makes a tree grow faster than by pruning it. Nothing makes sex more interesting than suppressing it.
Yeah, and that's true.
Oh, excellent. Dr. Ray, thank you so much for joining us today. If people want to find out more about recovering from religion and the Secular Therapy Project, where can they find you?
You can go to recoveryfromreligion.org, and we've got a contact place there, or you can email me directly at Darrel@recoveringfromreligion. You can go to seculartherapy.org. If you need help, if you need a good therapist that won't send you back to church, go to seculartherapy.org. If you need to talk to somebody about your deconversion or whatever you need, our motto is we offer hope, healing, and support for those dealing with doubt and non-belief. So go to recoveryfromreligion.org and hit the chat button, or call the 844 I doubt it. That's our phone number. 844 I doubt it.
I doubt it. That's good.
That's within North America, but we also have direct phone lines from England, from South Africa, from Australia, from New Zealand, and you can call us on your IP anywhere on the planet. So we get calls from virtually every country on the planet, or chats from almost any country, and we are here to help.
And we will see you, of course, back on November 12th.
Yep, looking forward to it.
That's going to be fantastic, guys. Look that up. Go Recovering from Religion and buy a bingo card. Dr. Ray, before I let you go, as per usual, I have to have you say, hi, this is Dr. Darrel Ray, and I took a left at the valley.
Hi, this is Dr. Darrel Ray, and I took a left at the valley.
Fantastic.